Good morning. It is very early in the morning here in Monterey. So welcome to the Critical Issues Forum online teachers workshop. Today, I am very happy to have Ms. Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova, Director of the International Organizations and Nonproliferation Program at the James Madison Center for Nonproliferation Studies. She is talking from our Vienna office in Austria. Her lecture covers background and overview of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So today's lecture is especially important for this year's CIF project, as this is a topic we are going to cover for this year's project. So her lecture is going to be divided into two parts with a short break. First part is going to cover the recent nuclear disarmament initiatives, including the humanitarian initiatives, and the second part focuses on the nuclear weapons ban treaty. Gaukhar participated in the most of the ban treaty negotiations that happened earlier this year. One of her most recent articles, The Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty, Negotiations and Beyond, published for the Arms Control Association in September, is of course included in the useful resources for this year's CIF project. She's a widely published scholar on nuclear proliferation issues, including the co-authored Adleaf book, Nuclear Politics and the Non-Aligned Movement. She has extensive experience as a delegate and a non-governmental representative to international fora, including meetings of the NPT Radio Conference and the International Atomic Energy Agency, and of course, the ban treaty negotiations. She has also served as lead instructor for many CNS intensive short courses for practitioners and diplomats. Gaukhar received her MA in International Policy Studies with a distinction from the Monterey Institute of International Studies, and BA in Journalism, Mass Communication with cum laude from the American University in Bulgaria. She is originally from Almaty, Kazakhstan. So I am delighted to have Gaukhar for this year's CIF Teachers Workshop. So now let me give you the microphone, Gaukhar.
Thank you, Masako. Okay, well, thank you very much for that detailed introduction. And I'm very pleased to be speaking with the CIF Forum Workshop again, covering, as Masako said, recent disarmament initiatives, particularly the humanitarian initiative that has led to the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I participated in some of the negotiations, and we'll be happy to offer a perspective of what happened there and what some of the issues were, and probably try to discuss as well some of the implications and the way forward. So I'm going to share my screen. So these are going to be my slides, and I'll send the slides later to Masako for sharing. So disarmament initiatives and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. To start at the beginning, since the very dawn of the nuclear age, after the first use of nuclear weapons against Japan, and then subsequent beginning of the nuclear arms race, first between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then others joining, there has also been a push to eliminate nuclear weapons. And for much of the nuclear age, there seems to have been an agreement that the ultimate goal should be elimination of nuclear weapons, or zero nuclear weapons. However, there has been much less agreement, if any, really, about the best way to achieve it. And the more nuclear weapon possessors appeared, the harder the question became. The longer the states possessed nuclear weapons, the more wedded they were becoming to nuclear deterrence policies and to having nuclear weapons. And the more intractable the debate seems to be about the best way to actually achieve zero, and to big differences, right? To big viewpoints that we saw coming to pretty much conflict in recent years is the comprehensive approach, or the approach that previously used to be associated with the Nuclear Weapons Convention, versus the much more gradual step-by-step approach that is supported by nuclear weapon states and a lot of their allies. But the question, of course, is not new. It has been with us since the very beginning. And we won't talk about the bilateral paths, the bilateral reductions between the United States and Soviet Union and Russia today, because we will be focusing rather on the multilateral approaches to nuclear disarmament. And the multilateral disarmament agenda has been set since the late 50s, beginning 1960s, in the UN disarmament bodies, such as the 80-Nation Disarmament Committee. And there, basically, the most important 3 steps were identified as prohibition on nuclear testing, and that was the first big push of the UN nuclear disarmament movement around the world, is to stop nuclear testing in all environments, and then the prohibition on the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons, and non-dissemination of nuclear weapons. We can see that of the 3 steps, the last one has been the most successful, with the negotiation entry into force and mostly successful implementation of the Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT. We have a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty in place, but not in force. So that's been a protracted situation since 1996. And we have yet to begin negotiations of a fissile material production ban or fissile material cutoff treaty, and that has been rather hopelessly stuck in the Conference on Disarmament. But you can see that the agenda hasn't renewed itself very much since the 1960s. In terms of the legal obligation to actually accomplish nuclear disarmament, what we have is Article 6 of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which commits all parties to that treaty to pursue negotiations in good faith towards effective measures on nuclear arms, on stopping the nuclear arms race, and nuclear disarmament, and eventually the Treaty on General and Complete Disarmament under strict and effective international control. So because the 5 nuclear weapon states, US, Russia, France, UK, and China, are parties to the NPT, they're also subject to this legal obligation to pursue good faith negotiations towards nuclear disarmament. However, unlike the non-proliferation commitments under the NPT, the disarmament commitment doesn't have any specific measures attached to it. There's no obligation such as safeguards, for example. There is no timeline attached to the pursuit of disarmament negotiations. There is no deadline by which disarmament is supposed to be accomplished according to the treaty. There are no specific benchmarks to measure progress, and there's a requirement that disarmament should be achieved under strict and effective international control, but there's no further indication, there are no further guidelines as to the verification of nuclear disarmament. So these all have been the challenges that the NPT states parties have grappled with since the treaty entered into force in 1970. And the review process of the NPT have always been dominated by the disagreements on the progress on nuclear disarmament. Non-nuclear weapon states mostly arguing that the progress has not been enough, has not been fast enough, that the nuclear weapon states haven't been ambitious enough in their disarmament measures, whereas nuclear weapon states and at times their allies argue that they have been doing all that they could, and that the way forward is this continuous, gradual, step-by-step path. So to deal with disarmament on a multilateral scene, we have the so-called UN disarmament machinery. And that is a set of different institutions and mechanisms that have been put in place through the United Nations system. We have the first committee of the UN General Assembly, and that's committee devoted exclusively to disarmament and international security issues. It has a 1-month session every year, every October, and the first committee adopts resolutions that are politically binding rather than legally binding. So they serve to express and manifest different states' views on a variety of disarmament issues, including nuclear disarmament. However, what the first committee can also do is establish negotiating mandates, and that it has done so several times in the past, most recently with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, by adopting a resolution that basically mandates the negotiation of a new instrument. UN Disarmament Commission is a deliberative body. It's supposed to discuss disarmament issues and provide recommendations on what the other machinery elements should be addressing. So it's supposed to have recommendations for the Conference on Disarmament, for example. For a long time, the UN Disarmament Commission wasn't able to adopt any consensus reports, and they strive for consensus. There was a bit of a breakthrough this year in 2017, where they adopted recommendations, but only on the conventional weapons. They still weren't able to agree on nuclear disarmament questions. And then we have the Conference on Disarmament, which is an heir to the previous disarmament negotiating bodies under the UN. It's 18-Nation Disarmament Committee. That's where the Non-Proliferation Treaty was negotiated, subsequently known as Conference of the Committee on Disarmament, and now Conference on Disarmament. It currently has 65 member states, and it is known as the single disarmament negotiating body. So for the one UN body that's entrusted with negotiating disarmament treaties, it doesn't seem like it's very representative with only 65 member states. And indeed, a number of countries have been knocking on the door of the Conference on Disarmament for years now, asking to expand the membership, but that hasn't happened yet. Even though Conference on Disarmament is established through a UN decision, it has its own rules of procedure, it sets its own agenda, and unlike the UN General Assembly, unlike UN First Committee, it operates by consensus, which means that all 65 member states have to agree for any decision to be adopted, and that includes procedural decisions such as the program of work. Why is that important? It's become a major obstacle to the work of the Conference on Disarmament. The reason being that to take up any issue and to actually begin negotiations, the conference has to adopt a program of work and establish ad hoc committees or bodies to actually do the work, the negotiations. And that program of work has to be adopted every year. And so every year you have to have consensus on this, and we haven't, and the Conference on Disarmament hasn't had that since 1996, with the brief exception of 2009, where they adopted a program of work, but it was a bit late in the year to actually begin the negotiations. And when they came back next year, there was no consensus anymore. The Conference on Disarmament has had successes, of course. The last resounding success, I suppose, was Chemical Weapons Convention adopted in 1993. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was negotiated completed negotiations in 1996, but the conference didn't actually agree on the text of the treaty by consensus. India objected, and it took some procedural tricks by other states for the text of the treaty to be taken to the UN First Committee and be voted as part of a resolution so that it could open for signature. But since 1996, the conference hasn't been able to negotiate anything, to begin any negotiations. And the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty is often described as the next logical step, the next logical agreement that the conference should negotiate. But there still is a disagreement on the negotiating mandate for it. And basically we've had a deadlock since 96 that was an interplay of 4 issues. One of them, the fissile material cutoff, the other is the prevention of an arms race in outer space, and then 2 issues championed by the non-aligned movement, and those are the developing countries in the conference. The negative security assurances, or the guarantees that nuclear weapon states would not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. and nuclear disarmament, which for the non-aligned movement for the longest time meant the beginning of negotiations on a comprehensive nuclear weapons convention, something like a chemical weapons convention that would prohibit nuclear weapons and also have provisions for nuclear disarmament and verification of disarmament. Currently, Pakistan is blocking the program of work because of its objections to fissile material cutoff treaty negotiating mandate. But previously, different countries also blocked progress on the conference. Russia and China over the space issues. The United States at some point didn't support FMCT negotiations, arguing that the treaty wouldn't be verifiable. But most recently, it's been Pakistan primarily blocking progress, and this has generated a lot of frustration among non-nuclear weapon states in particular, nuclear weapon states as well, but the non-nuclear weapon states, and especially those who are not in the Conference of Disarmament, feel very disempowered because the one body that is charged with negotiating disarmament agreements hasn't moved since 1996, and proposals on the reform on the Conference on Disarmament to begin some kind of negotiations, they also haven't gone anywhere. And states that don't want to see the reform would argue that it's not the procedural issues that are preventing progress, but the lack of political will. So doing away, for example, with a consensus rule, at least for the adoption of the program of work, won't actually solve the issues. But you can imagine that it's been, 3 decades now, or 2 decades now, and states want to see things move rather than repeatedly gathering, for example, for the NPT review process meetings and fruitlessly calling on the Conference on Disarmament to finally break the deadlock and begin negotiations. What's happening in the meantime was, on the one hand, yes, we had this period of hopefulness when the Obama administration began its term, and we had this so-called arms control spring, right, with the new US president talking about the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons, recommitting the United States to nuclear disarmament, pursuing a new bilateral agreement with Russia on nuclear weapons reductions. So we had that brief moment of a lot of hope. But at the same time, all of the nuclear weapon states either continued or began very serious nuclear weapons modernization programs. They don't necessarily entail producing new kinds of nuclear weapons, but they do entail extending the range, for example, of existing nuclear weapon delivery vehicles, or extending the lifetime, improving precision. All the actions that are signaling to non-nuclear weapon states that the armed states are projecting reliance on nuclear weapons for decades ahead. And that's a very disheartening development to observe, while at the same time you're being told that yes, progress on disarmament is being made, or that we're doing everything we can as fast as we can, and the conditions are simply not in place for more measures on nuclear disarmament. And you eventually also start to see this kind of recommitment to the role of nuclear weapons in government statements and in defense papers. Russian President Putin said that Russia would not, under no conditions, give up its strategic deterrent capability, but rather strengthen it. UK Prime Minister talked about the United Kingdom needing nuclear weapons today as much as 6 decades ago. And the French white paper on defense, reaffirming again that nuclear deterrence is the ultimate guarantee of France's sovereignty. So combined with the lack of progress in Conference on Disarmament, very, very slow movement in other forums, this was really building up around 2012, I would say, after the 2010 NPT Review Conference. This was really building up to this condition where non-nuclear weapon states were hungry for action and were actually ready to start taking steps themselves. And we saw this very interesting development where the debate traditionally owned by the nuclear weapons possessors was starting to slip away from them, because non-nuclear weapon states were demonstrating more and more ownership of the issue and requiring their own voice on the matter. And in fall 2012, there was a very active session of the UN First Committee, where a number of new resolutions were adopted, or new elements were added to the regular resolutions. Canada, for example, usually sponsors the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty resolution. And this time in 2012, rather than just again calling on the Conference on Disarmament to begin negotiations, they proposed the creation of a group of governmental experts to address different aspects of the treaty that would have to be discussed once the negotiations begin. And then that group of experts convened in 2014 and 2015, submitted its report to the UN General Assembly. So that was a new development, an attempt to get things moving somehow. The NAM, the Non-Aligned Movement, championed a resolution on high-level meeting on nuclear disarmament, which eventually took place in September 2013. And the follow-on resolution mandated convening a conference, a high-level conference on nuclear disarmament by 2018. It was not entirely clear what the goals of the high-level meeting and the conference were beyond attracting sort of high-level political attention to the issue. But now we have a decision, most recently, from the UN to convene this high-level conference in May 2018, really shortly after the second PrepCom session, preparatory committee session of the NPT review process. So we'll see what happens with that. But again, that was a new thing that happened. And then the two initiatives that were the most interesting, I think, and the most significant were the open-ended working group on taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations and the humanitarian initiative, which emerged independently from the UN First Committee. So the open-ended working group, the initial idea was to have actually 4 working groups, one for each of the issues that are blocking the CD discussion: disarmament, negative security assurances, outer space, and the FMCT. And a lot of states were not happy with that proposal. They saw that as undermining the Conference on Disarmament, as taking issues away from the Conference on Disarmament. And so the authors of the resolution then reworked it and suggested to have one open-ended working group. And when they say open-ended in the UN, what they mean is that it's open participation for all UN member states. Unlike the group of governmental experts, where you would usually have a limit of 25 participants, and you specifically, and the UN Secretary General would have to invite specific countries to nominate experts. An open-ended working group is just that; it's open to all UN member states. And in that open-ended working group would talk about ways to take forward disarmament negotiations without any specific agenda preset. And that gave the group great flexibility and provided for a pretty good discussion, actually. And the group, of course, didn't have any negotiating mandate, and that was another reason that many states were able to support it, because otherwise, again, there was concern that it's taking issues and the role away from Conference on Disarmament. The nuclear weapon states opposed both the high-level meeting on nuclear disarmament, saying that it's just a strange timing and they not in line with the NPT review process and a distraction. And they especially opposed the open-ended working group, saying that it's not a helpful initiative, that it's taking away from other disarmament work, and especially from the NPT. So the 5 jointly boycotted the open-ended working group once it convened. India and Pakistan actually did show up the open-ended working group, but not Israel. Humanitarian initiative I'll return to it later because that's the most significant development we've had since 2010, and that's the one that more or less specifically led to the negotiation of the ban treaty. So a little bit more on the open-ended working group, because it's also played a role in advancing this idea that we need a prohibition treaty. It was perhaps the first substantive and interactive discussion on nuclear disarmament in the diplomatic community in years. When you come to the NPT review process meetings, states read their statements and there's very little actual debate on substantive issues until they get to the negotiation of the final document. And even there, it's a lot of arguments about language. And you don't get discussion with, for example, participation of outside experts. And this is what was different about the open-ended working group. They opened participation to civil society, and that's very unusual for nuclear weapon-related fora. So NGO representatives were able to register as participants, take the floor and make their comments and statements, and submit working papers to the group. A bit of self-promotion there. That's a picture of me just before I took the floor to comment on some issue or another. The chair of the open-ended working group had a lot of flexibility with the format, and one of the good ideas that they came up with was to have panel discussions to kick off the work of the open-ended working group. They invited experts, again, from civil society to have thematic panels on different issues like nuclear doctrines, the alerting or posture, disarmament verification, nuclear weapon-free zones, etc. And you could see how hungry the diplomats were for substantive engagement, because it was panel discussion format. Diplomats relaxed; they were not sticking to their statements. They actually asked questions. They asked questions to each other. It was a good, interesting, substantive discussion, which unfortunately took place in the absence of nuclear weapon states, because, as I said, they boycotted the whole endeavor. So the open-ended working group convened in 2013, and it didn't have a negotiating mandate. So in the end, they just adopted the report with summaries of discussions they had and attaching all kinds of different proposals that were submitted during the work. What was interesting and what fed into the discussions at the 2015 review conference of the Nonproliferation Treaty was this debate that I mentioned before about whether we need a comprehensive approach to nuclear disarmament, one big agreement, or we have to stick to this step-by-step approach. And states discussed that those don't have to be mutually exclusive necessarily. And very importantly, that a step-by-step approach seems to presuppose too much that there ought to be a sequence of steps. And until you complete this next step, you cannot move to another one. And that's where you have the emergence of this idea of a building blocks approach, where you have different elements that are necessary to achieve the world without nuclear weapons, but they don't have to be this sequential ladder thing. You can pursue different elements simultaneously. If you cannot work on one thing, like the fissile material treaty right now, you could maybe work on other elements. At the same time, the New Agenda Coalition, and that's the coalition of countries that are not in any kind of nuclear weapon alliances, they started asking, well, if we do need a new instrument to achieve nuclear disarmament, and by instrument they mean a legally binding treaty, for example, does it have to be a comprehensive nuclear weapons convention? Do we need just a ban on nuclear weapons first and then work out details later, or should it be some kind of a framework agreement or an umbrella convention with other elements underneath it? And that was an important discussion that fed into the debates at the review conference and then later into the 2016 open-ended working group. But as I said before, the biggest development, and the one that caught the most attention and inspired, I think, the most participation is the humanitarian initiative. It based itself in a paragraph, in a sentence really, in the final document of the 2010 NPT Review Conference, which expressed deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and reaffirmed the need for states to comply with international humanitarian law at all times. It might seem surprising, but this is the first time that the NPT document actually talked about humanitarian consequences and concern about them. Of course, the horrific impact of nuclear weapons use was at the core of the initial disarmament movement, right? The world was horrified by what happens when nuclear weapons are used against people. But then in the context of the Non-Proliferation Treaty discussions and UN discussions, that humanitarian aspect kind of faded into the background, and the discussions were focused on, state security, state policies, promises of accomplish certain steps by a certain time, and all the reasons that the nuclear weapon states couldn't do it. So the question of what happens when nuclear weapons are used, what happens to people, to the environment, that was never central to the NPT discussions. And that's what this humanitarian initiative was set out to change. It wanted to bring humans and the impact of nuclear weapons back into the focus and into the center of the discussion. And so it had to raise a number of topics. Some of them more studied than others, some of them more well known than others. So when the nuclear weapons are used, the nuclear weapon is detonated, there are certain things that we know happen, and they're widely sort of recognized. It's the thermal radiation, the blast, the shock wave, and then the ionizing radiation. Now the awesome power, the destructive power, immediate destructive power of nuclear weapons. What's been less discussed, and what the humanitarian initiative, at least in the beginning, was focusing on, was what are the response needs? Okay, so a nuclear detonation takes place and the impact is terrible. What do we need to do in response? Who is supposed to respond other than the affected state? Do the international bodies have the mandate and the means and the plans? What are the longer term effects of nuclear weapons on environment, on climate, and consequently on food supply? Effects on the economy. Today's world is very different from 1945 in terms of economic interdependence. So the use of nuclear weapons in one place might have much more severe consequences for everyone around the world than previously. And the long-term public health consequences that were, with time, were studied less and less. So these were the kinds of questions that the humanitarian initiative was bringing into focus. And the initiative developed along two sort of parallel tracks. One was the political track, and it manifested itself primarily through a series of joint statements in the UN First Committee and at the NPT Preparatory Committee meetings and the Review Conference. And there the initiative really snowballed. It began with a joint statement by only 16 nations at the 2012 NPT Preparatory Committee meeting. From what I heard, there were several diplomats were sitting in Geneva at the UN building in the cafe, and they wanted to make a statement about the unacceptable impact of nuclear weapons, and so they gathered 16 like-minded states and people and came up with a joint statement. Then by the time of the 2013 NPT PrepCom meeting, it was already an 80-nation statement, and that's a very significant number. In fact, when South Africa was delivering that statement, they began by traditionally reading out all the countries that subscribed to it, and when they were done reading it, there was an applause. Of course, it was instigated by the non-governmental representatives, but it's still very unusual to have this kind of reaction to any statement in the NPT format. By the time of the first committee in October 2013, there were already 125 countries signing up to that statement, and it became that momentum became impossible to ignore. And so even those who couldn't sign on to that statement, they felt that they had to express themselves on the issue as well. And the reason there were countries that couldn't join the statements but still wanted to talk about it is because it included a phrase that everything we know now about the impact of nuclear weapons leads to the belief that they should never be used again under any circumstances. And that phrase, under any circumstances, became problematic primarily for nuclear weapon states allies, US allies. Among them, states that have traditionally been active in the NPT and seen as disarmament advocates. So the initiative, by putting it in very stark terms that nuclear weapons must not be used ever again under any circumstances, revealed some of the divisions that were there but not very evident before this series of statements. And so countries like Germany, like Japan, Australia, who traditionally have been active in the disarmament debate, they found themselves in an awkward situation where they couldn't join a statement that expressed concern about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons because they are US allies and their national security concepts and doctrines presuppose that nuclear weapons might be used on their behalf, in their defense by the United States. Moreover, some of the NATO allies host nuclear weapons on their territories, and NATO, of course, has defined itself as a nuclear weapon alliance in the sense that the use of nuclear weapons is very much part of the NATO security concept. So those divisions became more and more evident in the NPT context, and they started to worry some people, and nuclear weapon states in particular started pointing out that this is the humanitarian initiative is divisive and it's too antagonizing, and countries like Australia also argued that it's too alienating to put the question of whether you're for or against nuclear weapons in those kind of stark terms. So by 2013, Australia decided that they have to lead their own statement on the humanitarian issue dimension, where they also expressed concern about the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, but also called for the need to take into account security considerations, concerns of different countries. And this situation repeated in 2014 at the first committee and at the 2015 NPT review conference. The other track along which the humanitarian initiative developed was a series of conferences, and those were not strictly speaking diplomatic conferences. Those were supposed to be fact-based discussions of the issues that I mentioned before about the immediate impact of nuclear weapons, the longer-term impact, and response needs and capacities. So the first conference took place in March 2013 and was hosted by and organized by Norway. This one was smaller than others conference, partly because it was first and partly because Norway really didn't want to have the traditional disarmament actors involved. They didn't want the usual disarmament diplomats there. They wanted to focus the discussion on detonation effect and response, and invited humanitarian aid organizations, for example, and NGOs that work on humanitarian issues. Nuclear weapon states very much opposed the idea, and they actually issued a joint statement ahead of the Oslo conference saying that they together would not attend and that they don't think it's a helpful initiative, and calling it again a distraction from the NPT and real disarmament work, which I'm sure really didn't sit well with Norway, because think about it, Norway is a US ally, it's a NATO member, it's always had its own sort of position on nuclear weapons, but to accuse Norway of trying to undermine the NPT, I think that was too harsh, and it came to bite really, and to haunt nuclear weapon states. I think from the beginning here they took a very antagonizing approach that didn't work in their favor at all. They could have engaged early on, and they could have definitely influenced the conversation, but they chose to set themselves in stark opposition to this. One of the arguments they also put forward is that they, in nuclear weapon states, have studied the effects. They are familiar with the impact, and ergo there's basically no need to have a separate discussion on that. But again, non-nuclear weapon states were at this time reasserting their role in the debate, and so they wanted to discuss the consequences. They wanted to know what the response needs would be, and whether there is capacity. The next conference was in Nayarit, hosted by Mexico, and the last conference was in Vienna here in December 2014. Another thing that was happening at the same time is that every conference also had a civil society forum take place on the margins, and it started with Oslo, and Norway at the time supported this relatively new organization that I'm sure you're all now very familiar with. It's the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And so they asked ICANN basically to take care of the NGO participation, and ICANN organized the civil society forum, the margins of Oslo conference and Nayarit and Vienna. And by that time, ICANN was already focusing on promoting the idea of a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, not a comprehensive nuclear weapons convention, but rather a treaty that would establish a norm, establish a legal prohibition on nuclear weapons without going into the details of nuclear disarmament verification, with the understanding that that would be addressed later on. And so while the conferences themselves were not focused on those political issues until maybe Vienna, the civil society message was becoming much more well-defined and clear, that they believed that all the findings on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons lead to this urgency to negotiate a new treaty that would prohibit nuclear weapons. A little more about the conferences. The findings from Oslo, and again, this was not a diplomatic conference, there was no negotiated outcome. So what each conference, humanitarian conference, produced was a chair's summary of discussions. And so the summary from Oslo was that it is unlikely that any state or international body would be in a position to address the immediate humanitarian emergency caused by any kind of nuclear weapon detonation. And that obviously the effects of nuclear detonation would not stay inside state borders. They will be felt internationally. And that while political circumstances have changed, the destructive power of weapons obviously remains the same. So the urgency to eliminate nuclear weapons is still there. What those conferences stimulated, or the movement stimulated, is the production of new studies on nuclear weapons, the reinvigoration of debate on the impact. And one very interesting study that I think really brought the message home for many developing countries was the one devoted to the impact of a limited, quote unquote, nuclear war on climate and subsequently on food supply. So the popular perception, threat perception since the end of the Cold War had clearly changed. People were no longer afraid of a big nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union / Russia. And the fears about the nuclear winter caused by a massive nuclear conflict, that were very prominent in the 1980s were all but forgotten. But it doesn't mean that the threat of use of nuclear weapons has gone away, right? And what many people view as a more credible threat is a smaller war between, say, India and Pakistan involving nuclear weapons. And so a group of scientists in the United States looked at the possibility of, regional conflict between India and Pakistan, leading to the detonation of about 100 nuclear weapons, each of them about 13 kilotons. So a yield somewhere between the Hiroshima and between the devices used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then they calculated what would be the impact of that kind of nuclear war in terms of generating fires, which would generate the black soot that would raise into the atmosphere, block the sun, cause cooling, rapid cooling, and therefore climate disruption. And then they projected how that would lead to change in growing seasons for major crops, not only in India and Pakistan, but importantly in China and the United States, crops such as wheat, rice, and maize, corn. And so then the International Physicians for the Prohibition of Nuclear War examined how that would impact agricultural markets. They would certainly cause a worldwide disruption. States that rely on food supplies, on food imports, would be very severely affected because the prices would rise, and because states that export food, they would tend to hoard for a while because of this uncertainty and instability. And they calculated that up to or more than 2 billion people would be put at risk of a famine. And that's a very horrifying prognosis for consequences, global consequences of essentially a regional conflict. And it was a very stark illustration of the concept that the effects of a nuclear weapon exchange would not be confined to the two countries that actually attack each other, India and Pakistan, that this would be felt around the world, and especially in developing countries, including those that are far removed from the conflict, and they have forsworn nuclear weapons long ago, probably joined a nuclear weapon-free zone, and thought that, at least for them, the whole issue of nuclear weapons had been put to rest. But no, apparently if some nuclear weapon possessors were to have a nuclear war, lots and lots and lots and lots of people around the world would be severely affected. That, I think, helped re-energize the involvement of many non-nuclear weapon states that may not have been otherwise very active on the issue. Another issue that was raised, especially in Mexico at the next conference, was the risk of accidental use of nuclear weapons. So again, the perception of a threat of an actual war, deliberate war between the nuclear armed superpowers, that has faded in the public conscience for a while. But what started to come to light is that nuclear weapons are not as reliable, nuclear deterrence is not as reliable as one would be led to believe by nuclear weapon states. And the two aspects to that is one is the risk of accidental use due to some kind of safety failure or an accident. And on the other hand, possibility of a nuclear exchange due to miscalculation or misunderstanding. And the two studies, 2 books that you can check out are Command and Control by Eric Schlosser, and that's the one that talks about the safety aspect. And Too Close for Comfort, which is a study by the Chatham House, which focuses on miscalculation and misunderstanding. So Eric Schlosser did a lot of archival research and a lot of interviews and described several safety incidents in the US Air Force involving nuclear missiles. So this is only one country and only one so-called leg of the nuclear triad. And there's some terrifying things in that book. Of course, he couldn't cover all other nuclear weapons possessors because of varying degrees of secrecy, and he doesn't speak other languages. He didn't have the same kind of access. But it does raise a question of just how many other accidents we don't know about and may never know about, that brought us very close to a nuclear detonation that could have provoked, a nuclear war. In the Too Close for Comfort, the authors look at cases where we came close to the use of nuclear weapons because the adversaries misinterpreted each other's signals, or because there were some technical glitches in the system. For example, you might have heard of Stanislav Petrov, who passed away sadly this year. He was a Soviet officer on duty in 1983 when his early warning system that he was serving at indicated that there are 5 missiles incoming from the United States against the Soviet Union. And what he should have done, according to protocol, is reported up the chain, right? That there appears to be a nuclear attack. The people higher up may or may not have reacted. We don't know. We'll never know. But the thing is, he thought this didn't look real. He thought this must be some kind of a glitch in the system, a technical problem. And so he didn't report the incident immediately. And it did turn out to be a glitch in the system, a mistake, for which he was reprimanded because he didn't follow the protocol. But he's now known as the man who might have saved the world, because who knows, it might have been interpreted upstairs as yes, it is an incoming attack, and the Soviet Union could have launched a response. And in 1983, the tensions were pretty high. And there are other cases described in this report that really undermine this idea that deterrence, there's rational policy of nuclear deterrence would work, and nuclear weapons would not be used on the basis of a mistake or a miscalculation. So what also happened at the next conference in Nayarit in Mexico, along with discussing the risk of use and accidents, was a decidedly political turn. And so, as I said before, the conferences weren't political in the sense that they weren't supposed to lead to negotiated outcomes. And the chair's summaries were focused on just that, conveying what the discussions were about and presentations were about. But the chair of the Nayarit conference added something new. He added kind of his own conclusion that on the basis of the discussion on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, we should be leading to a commitment of states and civil society to reach a new international standard or norm through a legally binding instrument. And that's basically saying these discussions lead to the conclusion that we need to prohibit nuclear weapons by a legally binding treaty. And that took people by surprise, a lot of those who attended the conference, especially US allies, because a lot of the US allies did go to those conferences. They genuinely interested in the discussion, but they just didn't support this conclusion that this ought to lead to a new treaty in the short term. So they felt like they were deceived, or that their views were misrepresented. Nuclear weapon states, of course, pointed to this as saying, "Well, we told you so. That this is where it was. This is where it all was going by design." Another person whose life was complicated by this was the organizer of the next conference in Vienna, Ambassador Alexander Kment, who had to navigate the organization and agenda and trying to still engage the nuclear weapon states. And so Austria was actually successful in attracting both the United States and the United Kingdom to participate, which was a welcome development on the one hand. On the other hand, it was too late, I think, for the US to truly influence the debate. I think the issue had run away from them by that time. So the Vienna conference addressed some of the previously discussed issues. it went further into the question of risk of use by bringing in the discussion of postures or alert levels, how fast nuclear weapons can be launched by any given nuclear weapon possessor, depending on what policy they have, what level of readiness they have. They brought in the cyber aspect, which was also terrifying. Possibility of use of nuclear weapons through, hacking or some kind of spoofing action. And they also introduced discussion of international norms. They had a panel with an overview of what kind of legal instruments exist that would apply in the case of nuclear weapons use. So we're not even talking about NPT anymore, because that NPT deals with the spread of nuclear weapons. But for example, some of the presentations had to do with international health law, and because that really had to do more with response, environmental law and such. But the obvious conclusion from that discussion was that there's a lack of legal instruments that would apply or should apply in the case of nuclear weapons use. And there's clearly no prohibition on nuclear weapons use or possession. And that became known as the legal gap. Austrians called it the legal gap, and then that became the sort of the popular phrase to talk about the need to close that legal gap, that the only weapon of mass destruction that is not outright prohibited is nuclear weapons, and that ought to change. Another interesting thing that happens is that the conference received a special message from the Holy See, from the Pope. By then we had the new Pope, Francis. And the Vatican adjusted its stance on nuclear deterrence. For years, it said that nuclear weapons use is terrible and immoral, and nuclear weapons should not be used, but it was prepared to live with the concept of nuclear deterrence as one aimed at preventing the use of nuclear weapons, one aimed at defense. The new stance, the new paper that the Vatican issued, basically said that at the core of nuclear deterrence lies a credible threat to use nuclear weapons. Therefore, you can't separate the two neatly. There's weapons use and then there's nuclear deterrence. And that nuclear deterrence is indeed incompatible with the sort of modern ethics. And Holy See, for the first time in decades, broke with its sort of kind of support for nuclear deterrence, and now you see that the Holy See Vatican is firmly in favor of the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, and they just hosted a big conference on that subject, I think last week. In addition to producing a summary of discussion, Austria also issued its own pledge, and it was known first as the Austrian Pledge, where they promised to cooperate with all relevant stakeholders, other states, civil society, humanitarian organizations, in efforts to stigmatize, prohibit, and eliminate nuclear weapons in light of their unacceptable humanitarian consequences and associated risks. So picking up from Nayarit, where the chair talked that the logical conclusion is that we have to have a new norm against nuclear weapons, Austria here promised to actually pursue the establishment of that norm, the prohibition and eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. They renamed the pledge to a humanitarian pledge rather than Austrian, because a lot of countries started signing up to it, and they wanted to encourage that kind of movement. So in February 2015, 2 months after the conference, a whole continent endorsed the pledge, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. So that was a very politically very powerful move. And then by May 2015, you had 117 states signing up to the promise to pursue the stigmatization, prohibition of nuclear weapons. So naturally, that was one of the central topics at the 2015 NPT Review Conference, where a number of countries in their statements argued for the need, about a need for a new legally binding instruments to prohibit nuclear weapons. And the New Agenda Coalition tried to introduce this discussion about what form that instrument could or should take. But the nuclear weapon states were deeply opposed to that discussion. Most of their allies also didn't necessarily want that kind of discussion. And the central division at the NPT review conference was on the subject of nuclear weapons legitimacy. So when we were no longer arguing about things like, oh, you promised to negotiate the fissile material treaty by such and such date, or Conference on Disarmament is still stuck. Those seemed like easier issues now, because fundamentally the disagreement was about whether or not nuclear weapons are a legitimate instrument of security. And that is a much more profound disagreement than what we had before in the NPT. And nuclear weapon states, the US in particular, they of course saw the need to somehow overcome this. And that's when they kind of warmed up to the idea of an open-ended working group that they opposed back in 2013. So then they were in support of creating or re-establishing the open-ended working group to again talk about nuclear disarmament, but they wanted the working group to operate by consensus. The previous one was under General Assembly rules, so it didn't need consensus. And they wanted to make sure that it doesn't have any negotiating mandate. And the states that had previously championed the open-ended working group, they felt that this was not enough anymore. We already had discussions on nuclear disarmament. You chose to skip them. We don't want to have another body that would be controlled by basically a veto power because it requires consensus. In the end, there was no final document adopted by the review conference, so there was no agreement essentially to have an open-ended working group. But the idea was brought back to the 2015 UN First Committee. Interestingly, Iran picked up on the position that was most supported by the nuclear weapon states, to have a working group that would operate under consensus and not have any negotiating mandate. And Iran tried to garner support of the non-aligned movement. And here it had a bit of a surprise, because the non-aligned movement did not want to support that resolution. They wanted more action. And more action was contained in the draft of the Mexico championed resolution to have an open-ended working group that would not rely on consensus rule and that would have some kind of negotiating mandate. They adjusted the resolution. Essentially that the working group was asked to provide recommendations, and that's the resolution that was adopted and became the basis for the next open-ended working group. There were a number of other initiatives and resolutions in 2015, several of them dealing with the humanitarian consequences and the ethics of nuclear disarmament. And then Canada continued its quest to push forward the FMCT discussions. And so they championed the creation of an expert preparatory group, again, with the hopes to feed into the eventual negotiations of the FMCT. But the main I think, outcome was the decision to have an open-ended working group in 2016. It was building on the 2013 group and the discussions of the review conference. The mandate was to substantively address concrete, effective legal measures, legal provisions, and norms that will need to be concluded to attain and maintain a world without nuclear weapons. So the previous open-ended working group simply had to discuss ways to take forward nuclear disarmament. This mandate was much more specific, to talk about the legal measures and provisions that are necessary. And again, nuclear weapon states were opposed to that idea. A lot of the US allies didn't like that idea either. And then it was also asked to look at other measures in the meantime. It had the UN General Assembly rules of procedure, so it could vote. It was chaired by a diplomat from Thailand, and had 3 sessions in 2016. and no nuclear weapon possessors participated. So not only the 5 under the NPT, but also India and Pakistan didn't come this time as well, because they also didn't like the idea of the discussion focused on the legally binding measures. Unlike 2013, where you had a variety of topics raised and discussed, the 2016 Open and Working Group focused on prohibition, and that was part of its mandate. So a number of working papers and statements delivered at the Open and Working Group were focused on a nuclear weapons ban, and that's the one that's the idea that was promoted by civil society this whole time and was eventually picked up by states themselves. The idea that we don't have to wait to negotiate a comprehensive disarmament treaty all at once, because that would take a long time and it would require participation of nuclear weapon states inevitably. What we need most urgently is a norm that nuclear weapons are not legal, that nuclear weapons are not acceptable, their use and their possession, and then disarmament elements can be negotiated later, which means that the norm right now could be established even without the participation of nuclear weapons possessors. And I think the most important shift that we saw in 2016 was states, especially in the non-aligned movement, accepting this idea and kind of letting go and deciding that that is not mutually exclusive with the nuclear weapons convention idea that, of course, they championed for a long time. So you saw this support shifting in 2016, and the humanitarian pledge group grew to 127 states that calling for negotiations of a treaty banning nuclear weapons. The Latin American and the Caribbean group also called for a multilateral process to prohibit nuclear weapons. And then a much smaller group of states, US allies, called for a progressive approach. And it's kind of the redefinition of the building blocks, that we need to pursue a variety of measures for nuclear disarmament, but they didn't argue for legally binding prohibition, nuclear weapons, etc. So overwhelmingly, the 2016 discussion was focused on the prohibition of nuclear weapons through a legally binding instrument, and that's what basically led to the resolution eventually at the first committee establishing the conference to negotiate a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, which will be the topic of the second hour of the lecture, which I think will begin after a break. So I'll stop this for now and give it back to Masako. Welcome back to the part